All right, in today's video, we are going to go over the standard output versus the high output 6.7 PowerStroke. What's the difference? Which one should you get? We're going to go over all the technical aspects, go over all the facts, and share them with you guys. And Ford has been known to lie before, and that's what might be going on a little bit right now. We'll explain all that, so stick around, check it out. This doesn't make any sense. The standard output is beating out the high output. Hey guys, I'm Chris. This is Salty Trip Channel. We're all about full-time RV life, trucks, travel, towing, all that jazz. So if you're into that kind of stuff, you might want to follow along. But today we are going to be talking about the 6.7 PowerStroke standard output versus the high output motor. First off, to really understand what's going on between these two motors, you really have to know what the differences are. And I've been watching a few videos online, and they typically start out in like a dealership parking lot, and there's some car salesman that takes one standard output, drives it around the block, and then takes a high output, drives it around the block, gives his input about how he feels about it. And that doesn't really give you any information at all. We are going to go over all the technical aspects of this new high output motor, how it actually compares to the standard output. So you can make a informed decision whether you want to spend that extra $2,500 or not, or if there's an option for something else, if it was a deal breaker or not, but we're going to go over all of that. But first, we're going to have to go back to the Wayback Machine when the 6.7 first came out. Before 2011, Ford had never built their own motor. Before then, they were using International, but the 6.7 PowerStroke is the first one that Ford built on their own. That same year, Duramax and Chevy were fighting for the top-notch spot. Came out with this brand new Duramax motor, and they wanted to put a whooping on Ford. So they were in this kind of game of chicken to see who was going to put out their numbers first. Ford just went ahead and they put out their numbers for the 6.7 PowerStroke, and it was 390 horsepower and 735 foot-pounds of torque. Chevy got excited about that because about a month later, Chevy released their Duramax numbers, and it was 397 horsepower, which is 7 more horsepower, and it was 765 foot-pounds of torque, which was 30 more foot-pounds of torque than the Ford. So it beat out Ford in both numbers. Ford let Chevy prance around for about a month or so, and then about a month after they released the numbers for the Duramax, Ford came out and said, oh, by the way, we had our motor certified with 2 sets of numbers. And then they released their new horsepower and torque numbers. It was 400 horsepower and 800 foot-pounds of torque. So it just blew Duramax out of the water. That was a little damper on their situation. So they've been known to hold back when they didn't really have to. They could have just come out with those numbers right off the get-go, but they wanted to play chicken with Chevy and see what those Duramax numbers were going to be, and then release these new numbers. Sometimes Ford's playing mind games, and that is going to come into play a little bit later in this video, which I'll explain. So now let's go over the technical aspects of the new high output motor and what all the changes they made. All right, so we're going to start at the bottom and go to the top. One of the first things they did that was a huge improvement was they added the 9th injector. When these diesel trucks have to do a regen, they have the DPF, and if the filter gets full, they have to do a regen. And how they do that is they dump more fuel into the exhaust. And prior to the new high output motor, what they did was, I believe it was injector number 8, it just dumped more fuel in it and went down to the exhaust, got hot, burned off all that soot and let it exit out the exhaust. So what they did now was they added a 9th injector directly into the DPF, the diesel particulate filter, so that no longer are they just dumping extra fuel into the engine when they don't need to. If you need to do a regen, it just goes directly into the DPF and does a regen that way. It's way more efficient, and the big tractor trailers and stuff, they've been doing it that way for a long time. I don't know what took them so long to come around to this, but that was a big help. So now what did they do exactly to change in the engine to make it better? Well, starting at the bottom, they did add a high capacity oil pan that adds 2 more quarts of oil for going from 13 to 15 quarts of oil. So now the new high output motor with the 2 extra quarts of oil allows to keep the engine cooler, and also they upped the time between oil changes from 10,000 miles to up to 15,000 mile durations between oil changes. Now moving up, the next thing is they changed the compression ratio from 15.8 to 15.2, and I'll explain why they did that in just a moment. But in order to accommodate that, they redesigned the piston head. So it has new piston heads. They are steel, like the 20 to 22 models were steel, but prior to that, the piston heads were aluminum. So they upgraded those to new piston heads to accommodate the lower compression ratio. And the reason why they wanted the lower compression ratio, well, you think it's a diesel, higher compression ratio is better. Yes and no, because with the high output motor, they increased the boost and they increased the amount of fuel that goes into it. And in order to accommodate that, they had to lower the compression ratio to make all the numbers fit. And because of that increased boost and increased fuel, creates more heat. And that was one of the reasons why they added the more oil. It helps to keep the turbo cooler, keep the engine cooler, and going along with that, they redesigned the heads on the high output motor to accommodate more water flow and allow the engine to stay cooler under and more boost and more fuel being pushed through this engine. So we got the 9th injector, we got the bigger oil pan, we got the new pistons, we got the new heads. Also, they added new injectors with a 6% increase in volume to add for the counted extra fuel. They also did update to a new CP42, which allows for, it's the same rail pressure as before, 36,000 PSI. Like in 2017 to 19, it was about 30,000 PSI. Then in 2020 to 2022, they bumped it up to 36,000 PSI. It's the same fuel pressure as before, but it allows for more volume, which is why they increased the fuel injectors 6% on each one to add more fuel to the system to accommodate the boost to get that 1,200 foot-pounds of torque. And another thing they added that was buried way in here is a turbo, is they put a water-cooled housing on the front of the turbo. And you're going to probably think, well, they probably put that on because the more boost and the more fuel creates more heat. They put that water cooled to keep the turbo cool. That's not why they put that on. It's not what you think. And we'll go over that in a lot more detail in just a minute. But also, they replaced the regular exhaust manifold with stainless steel. That's a lot of stuff they added to accommodate for that extra horsepower and that extra 150 foot-pounds of torque for the high output 6.7 PowerStroke. Okay, now you may ask yourself, well, with all those upgrades, why would anybody get the standard output motor? Well, here's the kicker. All those upgrades -2 are in the standard output. They're exactly the same. The standard output and the high output motor roll off the same assembly line. There's not 2 different assembly lines, there's not 2 different motors, it's the same motor. The only difference between the high output motor and the standard output motor physically is the water-cooled housing on the turbo and the stainless steel exhaust. That's it. And then, of course, technically, the only other aspect is it's a tune. They tuned the motor, the high output motor, to boost more and to add more fuel. Other than that, these motors are exactly the same. The same big oil pan, the same 9th injector, the same new heads, the same new pistons, the same new injectors, the same new CP4 pump, all exactly the same, except for those 2 things. All right, so I've seen online people saying, you know, the high output has to have a bigger turbo, that's how it gets more power. Surprisingly not, it's not. It's exactly the same size. There's a YouTube channel out there called Duramax Tuners, and they actually did a breakdown of the 2 different turbos. They ripped them apart because they wanted to see exactly what the difference was, and they ripped them apart and they inspected every little piece and nook and cranny in that thing and took measurements of the entire thing, same diameter, same turbos, same amount of turbine, and everything was exactly the same, except for a few small measurements within like a fraction of a millimeter or so. Other than that, they were identical. And then they started to try to speculate what that water-cooled housing was for. And one of their speculations was that it was to cool the air before it gets to the intercooler, because when you increase that boost and increase that fuel, you create a lot of heat, and they wanted to, you want cool, dense air going into that chamber, and that just gave it the edge it needed to create the horsepower and torque numbers that it does. And it wasn't long after that that TFL Trucks came out with an interview with the Ford engineer, and the Ford engineer confirmed it and said it's basically just a pre-air cooler for the intercooler. All right, let's go over a few more facts about the high output motor versus the standard output. All that extra power with 25 more horsepower and 150 more foot-pounds of torque, what does that equate to real world, like towing? How much more towing do you get with a high output motor versus a standard output motor? I downloaded the PDF for their towing guide, and we're going to go over that right now. And some of these numbers are probably going to surprise you, because the standard output actually outperforms the high output in some of these categories. Okay, here we go. Looking at the, let's start out with the F250 conventional tow. That's the tongue towing. And look at the standard output versus the high output. And I'm going to go with the crew cab 4x4 6 3/4 bed, because that's probably the most popular truck out there. So we're going to stick with those for now. And we're going here, crew cab. But if you look right here, it says max tow for conventional is 22,000 pounds for the standard output. For high output, 22,000 pounds. Standard output, 22,000 pounds. So they're exactly the same. So this is for the F250 4x4 crew cab, regular bed, and they're exactly the same. All right, let's go check out fifth wheel and gooseneck. Fifth wheel and gooseneck. Standard output versus high output. We're going to go over here to the crew cab 4x4 3/4 box. And what do you know, for the F250, they're exactly the same again. 20,500 pounds. 20,500 pounds. Exactly the same for the fifth wheel. But for the gooseneck, it's the exact same thing. 21,600 pounds for gooseneck. 21,600 pounds for gooseneck for high output and standard output. Exactly the same. We do start seeing some number changes. We're going to go to the F350 now, the 1 tons. And we're going to look over here in the scooch over, see the crew cabs. 4x4. All right. So you have 23,200 pounds for the standard output, and you have 24,000 pounds for the high output. So you did increase 800 pounds. That is for traditional towing from the tongue. So you got 800 more pounds of towing out of that 150 foot-pounds of torque, which isn't a lot. But so here, let's go over to, we're looking at the fifth wheel and gooseneck towing now. Standard versus high output. We'll look at the same parameters. You're looking at, for fifth wheel gooseneck, it is, for fifth wheels, it's 22,900 pounds for the standard. And for the high output, it is 23,600 pounds. So that's a 700 pound difference. So in the fifth wheel towing, that actual gap dropped a little bit between standard and high output, a 700 pound difference. And the gooseneck, 23,000 pounds and 23,800 pounds for the high output. So 800 pound difference between the standard and high output and this configuration. So not a ton. You start to see some more differences when we get the F350 dualies and the F450. And some of these numbers are really going to surprise you, because I did not see this coming. Here we go. This is the conventional towing for the F350 standard versus high output. The F350 4x4 regular cab, exactly same, 24,800. The 8-foot bed, 25,000 pounds, exactly the same. F450, 25,000, 25, they're exactly the same for standard and high output motors. So here we go over to the F350 4x4s. exactly the same. Standard output or high output, 26,700 pounds. Now let's go to the crew cab. Let's go to the 4x4 configuration. And the 4x4 configuration, 27,000 for the standard output and 28,000 max for the high output. So you got 1,000 more pounds there. And here we go, the F450 for a conventional tow, 30,000, 30,000. Even Steven there, standard output, high output, you got the same tow capacity. So you're not really gaining anything in this particular configuration to get the high output motor. All right, now let's go to what's kind of a little more important to people, is the fifth wheel and gooseneck usually. So we're going to look at the standard and high output. Let's look at this one. Let's look at the one that's going to surprise you probably the most. Let's look over here at the F450 4x4 8-foot long bed crew cab. The standard output for a fifth wheel is 32,000 pounds. And with the high output, it's only 31,900 pounds. So the high output motor is 100 pound less towing capacity in the fifth wheel configuration than the standard. So the standard actually beats out the high output in this scenario. And for gooseneck, it's the same thing. The standard output for the F450, 33,100 pounds, and this is for the 4x4 crew cab 8-foot bed. And the high output is 33,000 pounds. So the standard output is, again, 100 pounds more. Let's look at the 350 now. The 350 4x4 8-foot bed, the max fifth wheel is 34,800 pounds. And wow, did it again. The max for the high output is 34,700 pounds, so 100 pounds less. This doesn't make any sense. The standard output is beating out the high output in this scenario. And same thing with gooseneck. No, it changed in the gooseneck. The high output went up. 35,200 pounds for the standard output and 35,800 pounds for the high output. So they got 600 more pounds out of the gooseneck in this configuration with the F350 4x4 dually 8-foot bed. Now where you see like the big difference is when you get over here to the regular cab, 2-wheel drive, 8-foot bed, and this is where you get that big number that they like boasting about, the 40,000 pounds of towing. And if you look over here at the gooseneck number, the gooseneck is 38,600 pounds for the standard output, and you have 40,000 pounds for the high output. So that's 1,400 pounds difference. Those numbers were kind of surprising, right? In some of these scenarios, the standard output outperformed the high output and tow numbers from Ford. I'm not making this stuff up. Go look it up yourself. Now you got to ask, well, if the standard output and the high output are basically the exact same motor minus that water-cooled housing and the stainless steel exhaust, why couldn't they boosted the numbers for the standard output? If it's completely capable of putting out more power, why didn't they? And here's my thing. I think they didn't do that because look at Cummins and look at Duramax. Duramax is what, 470 horsepower, which is still less than the PowerStroke, and they're not even breaking 1,000 foot-pounds of torque. So they're not really, the standard output is still outperforming the Duramax. And the new Cummins high output motor does put out 25 more foot-pounds of torque than the standard output of the PowerStroke, but it is way behind in horsepower. Even now with the 2025 release of the new Cummins 6.7, it's only 430 horsepower, which these are 475 horsepower, which is still 45 more horsepower than the Cummins. If they were to boost the power in the standard output, what would its competition be? It would be the high output motor. That's the only thing left. So why would they want to compete with themselves? So that's why I think they kept the numbers the same, is because they wanted to get more sales from the high output motor. Like I said before earlier in the video, Ford has been known to lie about this kind of stuff and just, well, maybe not lie, but definitely manipulate the situation to benefit them the best. And that's what I think they're doing with these numbers here, because this motor is completely capable of producing more power. It's got all the components for it. The only thing left is if we see, I think Duramax or Cummins actually had come out with some higher numbers than the standard output, I think one of two things happened. They would have immediately bumped up the standard output numbers because they're not going to let somebody else beat them out. Ford's that's just the way they are. They want to be on top when it comes to the diesel engines. The only other option I think they would do is they would just get rid of the standard output. And actually, honestly, I think that's what they should do, is just have one motor. They probably have a bunch of these exhausts and turbos left, so they're trying to get through them, and eventually it may just fade out the standard output, just like Dodge did with the Cummins. Is there's no longer the standard output, it's just the high output in the 2025 models and above. That's kind of what I'm thinking is going on. Now here comes the decision. Should you get a standard output or high output? We did not get the high output. And like, it wasn't really a deal breaker for us. Like if you look at the tow numbers, like I said, there's not that big a difference. So now you just have to determine if that's a deal breaker or not, the standard output versus the high output. People have been running through the mountains, the Rocky Mountains and everything with fifth wheels and goosenecks and horse trailers and all that stuff with this motor, with smaller motors, with the Cummins, with the Duramax, just fine. So you just have to ask yourself, is that 150 foot-pounds of torque worth the $2,500? And honestly, if this truck that we were looking at, because we wanted a certain color, we wanted the sports appearance package, we wanted the Lariat, and we were getting a great discount at it. And if this thing had showed up with a high output motor, I wouldn't have turned it down. I would have took it. Yeah, of course. You know, that's fantastic. So it just wasn't a deal breaker for us. Might be a deal breaker for you. You want to have the biggest, the baddest, and that's always going to be grass is greener. $2,500 worth it for you? It might be, or you may rather put that money towards Blackout package or Lariat Ultimate package or something like that. There's the facts. There's some speculation on what Ford is actually doing. And thanks for coming along. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, hit the subscribe button, notification bell, all that fancy jazz. Give this video a big thumbs up. Shows us you appreciate the content, because we appreciate you guys. And we'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.